Well, welcome back, everyone. I have the great pleasure of being with a very old friend, Sister Theovouli. We've known each other 30 years or more, perhaps.
At least.
Yeah. Now, Sister Theovouli is a very well-known iconographer. She's one of the first ones in Britain, and many Catholic churches in particular have icons. And she's done many things online. She's trained many people. So she's like the mother of many iconographers in our country. So it's a real privilege to have this time together. Perhaps you could tell us a bit about yourself, how you came to iconography and a bit of your past, your development, your growth in the monastic life. She's obviously an Orthodox monastic. And then I want to talk particularly today about iconography in the West, and some principles drawing on early medieval Western iconography, Romanesque sects and that sort of thing, and some of the challenges facing us now. And I want us to talk not just about panel icons. Most people today think about icons as panels, but the whole liturgical art, really, the visual liturgical art, so if we can keep it that sort of broad and deep. But first of all, let's tell us about yourself a bit.
Well, I don't think I would ever have been a painter in the first place if I hadn't started to go deaf when I was 11. So I started to go deaf in both ears. There was an operation which kept the hearing in one ear, but the effect of that was that I had to look at people. I had to be much more conscious of what people were doing, how they were looking, how they were moving. And because I couldn't communicate very well in speech, then I started to draw people. And, when people were talking and doing things, I could sit in a corner and draw them. So I did this, and when it came to the academic question of what I do after school, I had two choices. I either needed to go on in ordinary academia, or art school was a possibility because you could do your A-levels and so on at art school at that point. So I applied on the off chance and got into art school and absolutely loved it, particularly life drawing. I took to life drawing like a duck to water. And so went on through art school and had my big religious conversion when I was in art school. And that put me on the road to trying to find ways, authentic ways, to develop images, Christian images. How do you do it? What is a real representation of your Christian faith in art? So I went on doing that for quite a long time as an Anglican, and eventually by one of these happenings which one doesn't expect, I was asked by a community, I was already a nun by then, to help out with an iconographer who wanted somebody just to put out colours for him and be available. And I was also a professional artist. I'd used temper professionally. So I went in to do this. And what I was hooked on more than the painting at first was the actual theology. Because I thought, this is what I've been trying to do. I've been trying to reinvent the wheel. There's already been, nearly 2,000 years of this, So I decided, right, I've got to run very fast and catch up with all of this. But one of the questions which came to me then is, why have we not got a proper theology of the image in the West? So I began digging and digging and digging through that, firstly in the Anglican Church, then the Catholic Church. And the thing that seemed very obvious after a while was the lack of a good theology of the Holy Spirit, which is still unclear. There's very little written specifically about the Holy Spirit as the third person of the Trinity, I think, in the Catholic world, compared to the amount in the Orthodox world. and there was a resurgence of Pentecostalism, but that isn't a resurgence of theology. So I went on digging into this, and it seemed to me that inadvertently the formulation of the filioque, the Father and the Son and the Spirit proceeding from the Father and the Son, was actually causing a problem because it put the third person of the Trinity unconsciously into an inferior position. So that theology was not held so well. The other thing which I think was a depressant on development of that theology in the West was the influence of Schelman and the Council of Aachen and his anti-council to the Seventh Council of Nicaea. So
he emphasised much more the teaching role of icons, really. Just
yes,
good for
yes, he did.
For the ignorant.
He did
not
because
much in-depth theology.
Because you know, this whole thing of latria and proskynesis and the fact that the proskynesis was translated as adoration. You know, oh God, we can't have these icons.
Worship images.
Yeah, we can't have this worship of images. And of course, the worship of pagan images had been very well embedded in the West without any kind of development as there had been in the East about this whole process. So it was much more a thing of fear in the West that you would worship an image. So I think that had a depressing effect, so that images on the whole became partly teaching images and partly devotional, but devotional not integrated with the theology of the image.
Yeah, we're going to discuss that a bit later about the challenges facing the reintroduction really of iconography to the West, but what are the causes, the roots of this difficulty? So in your own life, you were exploring about the role of the Holy Spirit, the theology of the image. What was the next step in your journey then?
Well, I started to write icons, being encouraged by my teachers and so on, and I met you, and I spent some time with you, and you were very useful, very influential on my drawing, on my sense of design for the icon, which was tremendous.
That was in 1989 or something?
Was it?
Something
Not
like
sure.
That's when I was in Wales, I think.
Yeah, you were in Wales with Father
That's
Barnabas.
right.
That's right, yes. So that was very good. I also went to as many lectures as I could, particularly Mariam the Fortunato. I attended Albans and Sergius meetings. And I met Solomon Ness there, who's an iconographer from Norway. And I went out to Norway and spent a little time there doing the icon with her, and she had been trained in Athens. So that was all very useful. So I went on from there and was very conscious all the way through that I was dealing with a holy art and that there wasn't any place for quasi-icons and for individualistic work based on the icon, that it was a theological thing which I needed to work with. So gradually, more and more, I began writing the icon, I began teaching the icon, I began teaching people about Eastern Church and Eastern theology till it became utterly ridiculous. You know, and I was in the Catholic Church as a nun, but I was spending all my time teaching about the Eastern Church.
Some of our conversations about that, you were hoping to be like a bridge, weren't you?
Yes.
But I could see disaster coming.
Well,
disaster in a positive way. I could see that it was very difficult to continue.
The trouble is that then you come to a point where you think, Well, the Orthodox Church is becoming a fantasy for me. It's becoming an escape for me.
Mm-hmm.
So if I'm going to make a real relationship with Orthodoxy, I've got to be in Orthodoxy,
Mm-hmm.
and not just being a pretend outsider looking at it through, very beautiful spectacles.
Yeah. And that was, 10 years ago? How long ago was
More
that?
than that, I would think now. I'm not too sure.
Yeah.
Because it was all very
And
fast.
you became an Orthodox nun, and you had some time in a convent.
Yes, in the monastery in Crete, yes.
Great monastery. And then came back to a parish here, and you're
Yes.
practicing iconographer when you're half an hours and a woman
Yes.
of prayer. Wonderful. Good. Well, that's the background. Lives are a mystery, so I know that describing one's life is just like an icon, really. It's both like and unlike, and our description of our life is just touching the surface. But wonderful.
Yes.
So what I'd like us to explore a bit is, I thought under sort of three headings really, iconography in the West, challenges, possibilities and directions. So to start with the challenges, how would you summarise the challenges both of iconographers like you and myself in the West, but more generally the challenges facing the Catholic, Anglican and Orthodox churches, what to do with this iconography? Of course, Orthodox have had icons,
Yeah.
but we find ourselves in the West. Do we just import Russian and Greek icons, or do we draw on the early tradition of the West, and so on? So could you discuss a bit with us what you think the main challenges are facing iconographers in the West, like you and myself and any others you've met?
It's difficult because I think, particularly in Britain, I would say, because I don't really understand how to deal with the American situation yet.
Mm-hmm.
But I think certainly in Britain and on the continent, it's important that we rediscover the Orthodox tradition before the schism, and the Orthodox tradition of saints, and also the very fine work in iconography which was done in the early period, in the Anglo-Saxon period, and up to the 11th century. So you have the schism in about 1050.
So can you mention a few examples to us of Anglo-Saxon work? You've got illuminated manuscripts. What other things have survived?
Illuminated manuscripts are the most we have, because so much of the wall painting was actually destroyed during the Protestant Revolution. So we have a way of painting which is quite free, really, a way of drawing which is quite free within those manuscripts. And we also have a period coming into the 10th, 11th century, when the images and the methods are very similar to the Eastern world at that time. The divergence seems to come later along the line.
I've always found that this is more 11th, 12th century, the wet fold of the Romanesque, where you accentuate a curve rather than change it to straighter lines. That was something that was developing in places like Kastoria in the northwestern Greece at the same time. You have sort of fluffy, exaggerated curves on the archangels, lower gamma particularly. So there's some sort of correspondence there. Whether or not direct influence or there's some zeitgeist, I don't know.
Yes, it's interesting. I suppose that's what I'm trying to work on at the moment, having spent a while very much submerged in the Greek icon. Kind of just trying to find my way, which is why I've been doing these kind of drawings. Yes.
This one here. This one, isn't it?
Yes, this one's from a St. Matthew.
Yes. Could you tell us the origin of this one? Because that's from a Western manuscript, isn't it?
Let me show you. I forget what the Psalter is, but it's this Psalter.
Yeah, no, that's remarkable. That, yes. Yeah.
But I was struck by the way that we've got the 3/4 image, we've got the quite expressionistic face, we've got this way of using the hair, which is very similar to many of the icons. Think of John the Baptist and so on. And a way of holding the hand. Look at the way that hand is holding the pen. Very similar to a lot of iconographic technique, the garments are completely different. I'm not too sure I like all this.
It's a bit agitated.
It's a bit too agitated. That's why that one's by it, because although this is a profile rather than 3/4, it's got some very nice garments. That's the coronation psalter.
Yes, yeah. Yes, I suppose it's a matter of selecting, isn't it? Things that are usable, leaving aside those that aren't, rather than just a pastiche of a copy. Like, as you say, this is a bit agitated perhaps for traditional Orthodox use, but there's an expression about it that's still sober, so one can be discerning.
Which is still interesting. I mean, I'm very fond of the traditional Orthodox method of setting the curve against the angle, you know, which is kind of male-female talk of the image, you know, you're always setting a curve against an angle. You're always having something which is a surprise, an opposite, so you're always reconciling opposites as you do in Christ, God and man. So I think that part of the language is very important to retain and develop.
Yes.
The reconciliation of opposites.
So what would you say are some of the principles one needs to have in mind in discerning what's usable and what to put aside? So you mentioned the opposites. Union is always a relationship between two or more.
Yes.
It's never melting everything down into
uniform
grey. So that's one principle. Any other principles? Because there's so much in our postmodern age we could be influenced by having so many images on hand. We can travel and see the whole world if we want. So this is an advantage, I think, but also a potential, not disadvantage, but a potential danger that we just get so overloaded. So we've got to exercise some discernment. So what are some of the principles, do you think, in deciding what to use stylistically and what to lay aside?
Well, at the moment, I'm working on letting my hand do it.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
This is why I'm going back to the tonal drawings and just taking things which I feel have the right kind of spirit, both from the more traditional line of icons and from the earlier Western tradition, and seeing what comes out of the mix, to be honest.
I think perhaps Leonard Uspensky, in distinguishing between iconography and bad Western art, he sort of denigrated unwittingly the artistic aspect of an icon. An icon is obviously profoundly liturgical, but nonetheless it's art. So these aesthetic decisions, something that just seems right in the context of the church, etc. But I think this aspect of the icon, that it is an art form, has been lost sight of. And I think some of the best iconographers are most spiritual people, but also they're trained as artists often before. So they're making aesthetic decisions the whole time. The icon isn't just like a comic book that's to tell a story. You know, it's got to be what it depicts. It's got to embody in its stylistic form something what it depicts.
Yes, you see, I was very aware in Greece that people were writing icons, very good iconographic department in my monastery. And it was out of the Greek culture and out of themselves. So they were much freer than people in the West would be in doing that. You know, it was a matter of brushstroke and understanding tradition and being thoroughly imbued in it. But we're never going to be able to do that in the West because we aren't Greeks.
Right. Good point.
So we have got to find the tradition within ourselves, really. And that is more difficult because otherwise you're, in a sense, either copying or you've got a model of I've got to have it like a Greek icon, I've got to have it like a Russian icon, I've got to be right in this way, that way or the other way. The only way you have to be right really is you have to be theologically right. And I do think you have to keep that counterpoint both in colour and in technique.
Perhaps we're talking about Pentecost here, that the same truth is declared in different languages to different cultures. So it'd be false for us to pretend, to be Greeks.
It would be false.
And we've got to address a different culture.
Yes.
So we've got to declare the same truth, theological, spiritual truth, which can only really be known by experience. But in a language which is authentic for us as individuals, but authentic for the people who see it. It's interesting for me posting some of my work, well, all of it now is completed on social media.
Yes.
It's like a sort of survey, noticing how many people like something. It's a way of gauging people's reaction. It might just be an immediate reaction, but that says a lot. And the one that's got the highest hits is the relief wood carving I did,
Yes.
the 3 U's and the 5 furnace. It was different. I mean, it's very much an icon, but very different from anything else. And people sort of woke up and thought, wow, they're looking at it more.
Yeah.
As if I'd done an excellent copy of Rubliov's Trinity icon.
It's
a very good copy, but it wouldn't have elicited
by.
elicited that response.
Yeah. It's interesting that because the bas relief image has been actually fantastic in the West, all the way through to the Romanesque period and so on. It's been brilliant. And of course you have had the bas relief in the Eastern tradition, particularly the small Russian icons in that. They're gorgeous, they're incredible.
The cast brass ones, you mean?
Cast brass or wooden ones. I've seen some beautiful wooden carving of them. Yeah, and we kind of, I think we tend to ignore that tradition, and I think it's an important tradition to re-establish.
It actually started as a relief carver of icons because that's a professional sculptor before I became Orthodox. Jonathan Valjean, I got an email from someone the other day through my Patreon site who's a carver of icons, and he wants us to discuss this a lot more, so I said that I would arrange a podcast with someone to discuss the differences between painted and carved icons, because each medium is different, has its strengths and weaknesses. Like I found in it, it's polychromed, as this carving of the 3 U's, the 5 furnace was. You've got to work on a symphonic line, the outline. It's got to say what colour says for painting.
Yes.
Because it's relief. There is modelling, but primarily it's the shadow that one creates.
Yes,
and
exactly.
that's where you're looking at the river.
Yeah.
I just love those ivory carvings we find both in the West, the Carolingian and later, and in Byzantium, but particularly the ones in Spain and Britain to an extent. You've got a small space and they've got to tell us a story, a scene. So they pack the figures in, but they do it so skillfully.
Yes.
They don't like sort of lots of space with little figures, so they make the figures as big as possible, but there's so much skill, symphonic skill in conducting this symphony using form and line. And I've sometimes painted icons inspired by these carvings.
Yes, it's that kind of thing. You've got to be very clear-minded, I think, as an iconographer. What are the essentials you have to put down here to portray the person, and as a spiritual person, and also if there's a portrait tradition, you have to be able to recognise them. So you've got two things there. You've got the fact that this is a spiritual person, this is a portrait tradition, and what is the minimum really you can use in terms of colour and shape in order to show this person.
There's been some interesting scholarly academic work done on the icon as a portrait. Again, I think sometimes too much of a distinction has been made between the portrait tradition of Rome and the Roman Empire and iconography, as though it was a complete disjunction, but some academic work's been done showing that the Byzantines didn't make that distinction, that they're still in the portrait tradition, from the fine portraits. But obviously, being a new faith, then they adjusted the style, but this is a portrait of a real person.
Yes.
So this, you mentioned earlier about needing to look like them, and of course we have a lot of contemporary saints, of whom we have photographs, so Saint Symphony, etc. So could you talk a bit about that? Because that, I think, is something that's going to be growing challenged iconographers in the West. So what principles do you think one should keep in mind painting an icon of a recent saint of whom we have photographs? It's got to look like them, but where do you stop being entirely naturalistic?
Yes.
Freckles and all.
Yes, I mean, one of the problems I had a long time ago was actually a painting of someone who had an exceedingly large nose, And you know the whole thing about the nose being narrow and small to have the sense of heaven. You know, and there's also the same problem if you're faced with a Negro face. So how can you skillfully refine that shape, but actually still have, if it's a hook nose, a hook nose.
Yes, yeah.
So you can't be embarrassed about that.
Yeah.
There's
Perhaps
a problem.
If it's a dark-coloured skinned person, perhaps you've got to emphasise their spiritual quality in other ways, through the larger eyes or something like that.
Yes. And of course, dark has a positive aspect because we use dark as the mystery of God. You know, so that's an interesting way of thinking of depicting the...
And the highlighting on a dark-skinned person, that can give the sense of transfiguration and radiance.
Yes, which can be stronger in a way, can be much more dynamic.
Yeah, I've not done an iconomosis yet, Moses the Black, unfortunately,
Yes.
but I'd love to.
Yes, that's one of the problems. You tend to get the commissions you're given, not always the icons which you would like and things like that.
So we've discussed the challenges facing us, so it's hard to be authentic about our own traditions, so to draw on those early Romanesque, Anglo-Saxon, whatever. And I don't suppose there are any pat answers, but we've got to realise that icons are contemporary saints, or near contemporary saints. They've got to be recognisable, but not naturalistic.
Yes, and a big problem with that is obviously the question of wearing glasses. Because if you've got a saint who all the time is wearing glasses, nobody is going to recognise that modern saint without his glasses or her glasses.
Yeah. I did an icon recently, St. Luke of Simferopol, who's died in the 1960s, I think.
Yes.
And though he was a bishop, he was very much as a leading surgeon. So I put him in his surgical garments.
Yes.
This is for someone who was ill, someone who emphasised that aspect.
Yes.
Yeah. Right, possibilities. I've written here, although there are difficulties facing us, where we are is where God put us in the West, and so we must believe that there exist exciting possibilities for us. We can't complain that we're not in a Greek village or Russian village. So how do you see the main possibilities in terms of positives being in the West and being in the 21st century with all these photographs we have of icons and all the books we have available? What excites you about the time that we live in as an iconographer? What does it offer to us that wasn't offered to people living 200 years ago?
Well, I think it's, well, obviously one of the things is that interchange with other cultures, but also, if you look at it, we have to rediscover the roots of the Western tradition, but we also are living in a world which is post-impressionistic, Bridget Riley, post all these other people. And that also is part of our tradition. You know, when you come into the Impressionist tradition, they're really trying to deal with the question of light. When you come into the Cubist tradition, they're dealing with the question of form. These are things we should not just put on one side and think we've got to live in the past. Yeah. They're lessons about the visual image, which we can incorporate. But having done that, then the Greek, Russian, classic images have still got to remain the guideline. And the theology, of course, has to remain your primary guideline.
I quite agree with you, but it's quite a radical thing to hear none say that we need to learn from the early 20th century and the Impressionists. So could you tease that out in it? What sort of things can we learn from them?
It is, you see, they are trying to do radiant light, aren't they? And in the icon, we are always trying to work out how to do radiant light. And if you think of it, you know, the Greeks did one way, the Cretan school did one way with these very tight lines and so on. And the Russian school did a different way when they came across to Rublev and Theophanes in that period. We ought to look at things in the same way. Yeah. You know, what have we learnt about light that we can work with? but still be authentic iconographers.
I think it's one reason why Father Gregory Krug's icons are so loved. You could only paint that if you lived in the 20th century.
Yes.
I don't know if he set out to be 20th century, but he was imbued with the art movements of the time. But he was a man of prayer. He didn't want to make anything that was new for new's sake. But he had embodied and imbibed the best, I think, of the abstractionism of modern art, but integrated into the personalism of the Orthodox faith.
I think my own background in drawing, one of my teachers was incredibly classic.
Mm-hmm.
The other was very cubist.
Mm-hmm.
I actually learnt a lot about the energy of lines within the body and within space from the person who was quite cubist.
Was that Tony Vertise? Or
No, it wasn't. It was Lucas. Tony Vertise was a real classicist.
Oh, okay, he was that.
Ultimate classicist, Renaissance, everything.
Okay,
But Jim Lucas was very much more, his heart was in Cubism. But the fact he was in Cubism taught you to look at the person and the environment through the energies of the lines, and particularly connecting lines within an image or within the shape of things. And this is something which has stayed with me. I still do it. It's there in the icon, you know. It's something that I am very conscious of in the icon.
There's some recent research, a female theologian who's been talking about the analogia, not energy, but analogia of good iconography. It actually embodies and radiates the energy of the original. So, as it were, the artistic side of it, the aesthetic, the direct impact it has on you, even if you didn't know what it was depicting, just like good chant, I suppose, even if you don't understand what they're chanting, it has a direct impact on the souls. I think this is what people like the Impressionists were aiming to do. They were trying to elicit in the viewer the same impression that the painter had of that field of flowers or that lake.
Yes.
So that needs to be revived, I know I've been influenced at times by Batisse's use of colour. I remember looking also at Vermeer's paintings, and I've been going back a long way, but his use of silvery blues fascinated me. So I did one icon with just that atmosphere of silvery blues and silvery colours in my mind.
Yes. And that's something, of course, I think I should be saying Theophanes, should I? Theophan. Is... he uses these blues in his transfiguration. His highlights are mainly on the blues and so on. So there's something else where the blue gives you that extra glow.
And the famous illuminated manuscript of the Transfiguration, which is basically associated with Gregor Palamas's works, silvery blues and greens, and all of the time Gregor Palamas talking about the uncreated light. It's uncreated light has got inside the mountains, inside the garments, and everything is silver.
So there's a question of how now, having taken all this more modern knowledge about light, we actually do depict the uncreated light, as it were. Yes.
Great. So, do you think we're rising to these possibilities that only this century has offered? We can travel through art galleries in a way we couldn't before. Colour reproduction is much better. So even if we can't see an Impressionist painter, a Cubist painter, we've got pretty good reproduction. So, do you think that the Orthodox world, or the iconographic world, Catholic, Anglican, Orthodox, are actually rising to these possibilities, or we're a bit scared? Or
I think quite often we're quite scared because we're intimidated. We're thinking it's got to be like our Greek or Russian originals.
So what's
in one
underneath
sense,
it?
it's got to be.
Is it fear or what? Or what's holding people
I
back?
think it is a fear, and I think it holds people back artistically from doing their best in a way. You know, I think this is a difficult one. I think one needs somewhere, you know, in terms of a sketchbook or something, where one is going to experiment freely and just allow oneself to paint and allow oneself to respond to what one responds to in any icon or any other image, and just give oneself the chance to grow. I think there's a tendency to kind of think we've got to fit the form of something pre-made and be afraid to be out of that, because it's not about individual expressionism, which of course this is the problem of retraining the Western mind for a teacher, because once you say that to somebody of the Western mind, they think, oh yeah, I can go away and do my own expressionism and all of this kind of thing. And that's not the thing at all, because the freedom of expression has to come through the theology, has to come through the fact that your brush and your mind are really with the theology and with the theology of the tradition. So it's a learning process, plus when you have learnt a certain amount, to start to really think about the freedom process of it, you know, of really integrating what you have. And I think at the moment we're still a mishmash.
Yeah.
You know, we're a mishmash of styles. We're a mishmash of approaches because we're in a mishmash culture.
Yes.
But that is itself an amazing challenge, because we have to work through them, you know, which to a degree you've been doing with your work, you know, because you've looked back at the old roots, you've looked into the more modern things, and you're developing a fusion.
Yeah, it's a real challenge, but it does require courage. I think in the teaching I've been doing, in the public speaking, I've realised more and more that to walk with Christ is a dangerous business, in the sense that Peter, he's a skilled fisherman. He gets out of his boat and walks on the water. That's a mad thing to do.
Absolutely.
You know, to be a Christian, you've got to be a bit crazy. You've got to take risks.
Yes.
And Jesus tends to love the disciples, the sons of thunder, who take risks, because risk takers trust the one they follow, you know, not to slap them on the hand, you know, that he wants them to believe in him and believe that the miracles are possible. So I think, yes, this fear is something we've got to overcome.
I think this is one of the things in the early manuscript iconography. They haven't got that fear. They're taking risks, they're exploring, they're thinking, wow, this is something new, let's go for it.
And often the manuscripts were the top class ones were for personal delectation by the emperor. So I think the painters could be a bit freer then.
Yes.
It wasn't a public liturgical work. Interesting. Yeah, good. Directions then, I'm aware that time is pressing on, so we've looked at challenges and possibilities. Directions, so looking at iconography as it is now, where do you see it going in the next 10 years, and where would you like to see it going in 10 years?
Oh, this is terribly difficult to even think about. I think it's good when people do have the challenges of a big wall or a full new church to do.
Right.
You know, because I think that changes the dimension of the understanding of iconography, because I think, you know, we've got so used to precious little paintings, or within the Catholic world, statues and so on, but we're not thinking of these things as integrated space. We're thinking, I will introduce an icon or something else of a particular saint into an architectural space, but we aren't actually developing the iconography, the architectural space. I think that's probably one of the most important things we have to do. I also think we should not exclude stained glass. Stained glass was part of the earliest Anglo-Saxon monasteries. You know, the monastery...
the biscuit brought over stained glass workers from from
Weymouth Jarrow had the first stained glass in England. And
that's 7th century, 8th century.
Yes, exactly. So, and when you look at the very early stained glass, again, you're looking at something which is much closer to iconography. And the idea, the principle of stained glass was you are seeing the figure illuminated by the light, which is the principle of iconography. So I think there's a way in which these can work in tandem.
I think your point about getting beyond just panel icons to larger wall paintings and integrating with the architecture is really important. The last 3 large commissions I've had have been apses for Catholic churches, and it's been so exciting. And it led me to study a lot more the mosaics in Rome between about the 6th, early really, 5th century up to about the 10th century. There's so much there. It's eschatological. You're facing east toward the rising sun, facing toward the return of Christ.
Yes.
And what fascinated me there was that most of the images of the living Christ present here now in the liturgy, there's also an image of Christ coming to us out of the future, because these mosaics had brightly coloured clouds behind. So this is the sunrise, Christ coming, and also you have New Jerusalem around. So though aesthetically it's incredibly well balanced, nonetheless a lot is packed into these images. So I've tried to draw on these when I've been asked to depict whatever I liked, really. I mean, we discussed it, and they had some ideas of local saints, whatever, and obviously the dedication of the church, but I've been able to explore ways of putting a lot into these east wall paintings, because often there's no future opportunity for anything on the side wall, so this was it. This is the first and the last attempt. And I think that, and I found that wall paintings actually aren't that expensive. You'd think, if it costs this much for an icon that's 30 centimetres high, you have to multiply that by 1,000 to cover 1,000 times here. But no, it's not the case at all. You've got to work more boldly. It's going to be seen at a distance. Also, I found you can bring in apprentices who can do the simpler things, so you can move it along much more quickly.
Whereas the small icons, in fact, very small icons are relatively cost more than large ones, because this tiny work that everything, because people often think, oh well, if I have a very small icon, this will save me money. But in fact, if the subject is complex, it's not going to save you a penny.
As long as driving the painter around the bend.
Yes.
So directions. We've spoken a bit about the need not just to train liturgical artists, but also train and inspire present and future priests as to the importance of visual liturgical art. Can you talk a bit about that, how we think this can be done? Because there's no use having all these wonderful liturgical artists if they're not commissioned, or they've been briefed either badly or not briefed at all. Can you talk a bit about how you think we can help get to future priests and seminaries, etc., to inspire and educate them how to...
I think this is very important, and I think the way to that is actually through the theology of the icon, but taking the theology of the principles of the icon, rather than saying because the theology is this, you've got to look like Pancellinus or somebody like that. That's not what you're really talking about. You've got to make it understandable that the icon within a church needs to be a theological icon, and it needs to be part of the way you think about the liturgy. So that, if you look in the very early icons, you will see that one where you have Melchizedek and Abel and I forget.
Abraham offering up Isaac. This is in Ravenna in the mosaics.
Yes.
San Vitali has that.
Yes, but it actually picks up the canon, the first Roman canon of the prayer. So you've got things which actually pick up the canon of the liturgy, which you do instinctively in the Orthodox Church because people have been doing it for so long. But you don't do it instinctively in the Western Church. You don't think of your image on the wall as being related to the canon of liturgy you're celebrating.
Yeah, okay, so that's really important, that the architecture, the hymnography, the imagery, the ritual have all got to be tied in together. It's got to be a single symphony.
Yes, because every time you use an icon in the Orthodox Church, it has some relation to the liturgy, like the hierarchs who developed the liturgy standing around the holy table.
You're concelebrating with those.
Yes, concelebrating. And the Mother of God often in the apse above, and so, and this lovely thing of the two figures when you're going into the sacred space of the angel on the one side and the Mother of God on the other, the Annunciation. You know, and starting in the doorway with the family saints and the ascetic saints and so on, then going further and further into the mystery. That whole sense really, I think what one has to do is teach people how to design a liturgical building.
Yes, that's important. And I think this is a challenge for Orthodox, who often have to use, at least in this country, basilicas or neo-Gothic. They're not domed churches, they're not sanctuary, so we can't force those to try to be like a domed Byzantine church. And I think we suffer a lot from that. We've got to sort of think, well, how in the past have they dealt with the basilica? What lessons can we learn from that? Let's be true to this architectural space.
And the early basilicas are tremendous. They're tremendous pieces of liturgical art.
Exactly, yeah.
You know, you don't have to have a dome to do a piece of liturgical art.
Exactly.
In fact, you can use that length of the basilica in order to do your images of Old and New Testaments coming up the side, in order to introduce you to what is happening in the centre.
The famous example of that are the mosaics in Ravenna again, Apollinaria and Novel. You have the female martyrs one side, male martyrs on the other, all in white, processing
and taking that procession up.
Yeah.
And the procession of the gifts and so on. Yes. So there are a whole load of things there, which I think what a parish has to do when it is thinking of commissioning, it needs to think in terms of, even if it's just one thing they're commissioning, how does this fit in with liturgy we are going to celebrate in this building?
Yes, I'm hoping to get liturgists, architects, musicians, painters all together to cross-fertilise more, to inform one another more than has been happening. I think there's so much knowledge around these days. To add a bit of knowledge, you've got to go incredibly in depth into one little narrow field. A doctorate is on toenail or something like that. So this is needed, but there needs, I think, to be a new specialisation, which is generalisation, is networking, as it were, bringing together this enormous, massive information that's out there, all these scientific and academic papers, but look for the patterns, join up things.
Well, when I was in art school, a big emphasis at that time was interdisciplinary work, so you were working between departments, so in a sense that's what needs to be done in this, particularly with the architects and the visual artists. Because the architects are not trained to think of the visual artists as part of their sphere. They're trained to think of them as something that's added on if you really want it at the end.
So many times I've been asked to design a wall painting in a new church for the apse.
Yes.
And it's a massive window right in the middle. So I think, well, I've got a real problem here. I'll put Christ on one side, the Mother of God on the left, then that's not right. Christ should be more central. But there's no space for it. So they design something without considering what images will go there. So it's a real challenge. Yes.
My most successful one, that was the church near Cheltenham, where they had designed the whole church, but then when they came to look at it, they found they got a massive brick wall with nothing on it at the back, and it was a very square formed. Everything was square formed in the church. So I put a large icon of the type of the ascending Christ on the back, and that worked. And that was behind the priest when he was celebrating and so on. So that was a nice fusion.
Well, you're quite lucky that there was a blank space there. Yes. So we crafted it with things.
Yes, I was. I didn't have the window to contend with.
Sister Theovouli, it's been a real joy to have this time with you and to discuss things in depth. Though we live in Shrewsbury, we don't have enough time to talk like this, so we must do some more. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you.